David.
At a loss for words? No. Come on.
Very briefly, we were waiting inside because we were trying to find a place where we can make a declaration to Canadian authorities. Apparently there are no Canadian authorities here who we can make a declaration to. I understand there's a flight. Thank you so much. I understand there's a flight for us to Ottawa. We'll be making a declaration to the Canadian authorities that we were the object of an act of state piracy. Many goods and a boat were stolen. We were kidnapped and taken to, against our will, to the state of Israel and held against our will for 6 days in contravention of international law and also of Israeli law. We'll have a little bit more to say. I don't know how long you folks have. It's good to be home.
Gentlemen, are we able to either come down?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
We're free now. We can go where we want. We were attacked at high seas by overwhelming military force, even though they knew, and they told us they knew, that this was a peaceful mission. Again, this is a state which uses unaccountable, irresponsible force against unarmed civilians, who they know are unarmed civilians. I personally was tasered. We were all held under armed guard. When we were removed in Ashdod against our will, we were dragged off. Some of us were dragged off the boat and injured again. Searched multiple times, even though by that point they had already ascertained what they said was their goal, which was simply to find out that this was what we all know it is, an unarmed aid ship with absolutely nothing dangerous aboard. They had already ascertained that. They still stole the boat. They still kidnapped and brought us to Israel against our will. But again, I emphasize, this is behavior typical of a rogue state that does not respect its own laws or international laws. We were treated with a small microcosm of what the Palestinians of Gaza and the Palestinians of the West Bank put up with continually. A state which doesn't respect the rule of law, doesn't respect fundamental human rights. The other lesson to draw from this, it's a little bit emotional, is the power of human solidarity. We were able to push back on small things like free association with the other political prisoners because we were stronger in our numbers and we stood up for ourselves. We stood up for the rights of the people that were in prison with us, and this is a lesson. It was very clear that when we were held longer than the 72 hours set out in Israeli law, that's the maximum time any alien or any migrant is supposed to be held under Israeli law. We were held almost twice as long as Israeli law permits in contravention of their own laws. It was clear that this was an attempt to discourage us and discourage the freedom wave movements from going back. But as we learned to say from our Irish friends, Chuki lad, our day will come. This isn't going to stop this movement. On the contrary, it's going to make it stronger. We will keep coming back in waves of freedom until Gaza is free, until the blockade is lifted.
We had made it very clear that we had no intention or will or want to go on Israel land. We told them that repetitively. We refused to leave the boat. We were all carried or dragged or beaten to be taken into Israeli soil. Our stuff was made a mess of. Everything was taken. Those of us who were lucky kept their credit cards and their money. Some people lost even some of that stuff. It really is a situation that the Canadian government should not be quiet about. We are Canadian citizens, and we demand, we are going to file a lawsuit that we had been kidnapped from international waters, and we hope that the Canadian government would take a strong position about defending Canadian citizens all around the world, not pick and choose what it wants to defend.
Here, here.
Let's go to your...
C'est préférable de faire de l'entrevue en français avec.
Coming into the event, did you anticipate as many unwelcome guests?
I would say that everybody's welcome. You know, this is university. It's a place for debate and ideas. So I expect Zionists to show up and supporters of the Israeli occupation to show up, and they're, quite frankly, they're as welcome as anybody else. So I was surprised that they only had one question, but you know, the guy read his question, so maybe they didn't have time to write out any more questions. But you know, everybody's welcome. All questions are welcome. All discussion is welcome, provided it's respectful.
How do students with Zionist ideologies, how does that affect your teaching? If you're teaching in a classroom, if you're in a classroom with students that hold such ideologies, do you see any opposition coming from them?
It doesn't actually affect my teaching because the stuff I teach actually doesn't have much to do with politics. So when I teach linguistics, issue really doesn't really come up. But in general, university is a place for discussion and debate. So if people hold those views, the point is to challenge them and say, well, what's the basis in international law? Do we have a discussion which isn't about how you feel personally or emotionally, but can we ground this in some outside principle, like principles of international law or human rights law or things like that? And then we can move the discussion from how I feel or how they feel about Israel or about the occupation of Palestine to some external standard, which hopefully should be universal for all human beings. So you try to shift the debate towards external standards. That's usually a way of framing it that gets away from the emotional attachment.
What's your opinion, David?
Mm-hmm.
What's your perspective? What are your ideas? What do you think is the solution? What do you have to say to?
I like to bring it back to why a Canadian is involved, right? Why Canadians have a duty to be involved. I mean, all of us have a duty to take care of humanity. So, in a sense, human rights are everybody's business everywhere, all the time. But there's a particular historical responsibility of Canada for the injustice that was done in Palestine, because Canadian diplomats were involved in forcing the partition deal at the UN, because Canadians were involved in transferring the whole Zionist project from being part of the dying British colonial empire and the new American colonial empire. Canadians were involved in literally carrying that file from Westminster to Washington. So there's a particular Canadian responsibility. And now, you know, flash forward 2012, we have the most pro-Zionist government in the world. And that's not me saying it, that's Avigdor Lieberman saying it's the most pro-Zionist government in the world. So we have a responsibility now to address the fact that Canada is historically involved and continues to be involved in the occupation of Palestine. That doesn't give us any special rights that we have to do something. It's a responsibility that we have to shoulder the part of this burden.
In the long run, do you see Indigenous populations in Canada being empowered and using the same tactics, peaceful peaceful tactics that we're using?
Absolutely. I think nonviolent direct action has a lot of application here. It's not a coincidence that we had Bob Lovelace, an Aboriginal Algonquin leader from the Ardagh First Nation, with us. And it's not just words for him. He's been to jail to defend the land. And this is somebody who is very inspiring to me because in his simple, quiet way, he's got a very clear anti-colonial analysis. And as he says, he was trying to travel to Gaza with us because Gaza is the largest Indian reserve in the world. And he sees very clearly that this is an oppressed Indigenous people in Palestine, and it's oppressed ultimately by the same colonial empire that we have oppressing Indigenous peoples here. So he sees the unity of these struggles, and I'm pleased and proud to follow in his footsteps, and I'm delighted that we're bringing Bob here for Apartheid Week in Western.
Now, when we encounter some of the Zionists at the Solidarity for Palestinian Human Rights table, you know, some of the questions that we, or ideologies that we encounter are, well, Hamas throws rockets. One young woman told me that she said, well, it's like protecting London. You know, we would want the protection, and we're protecting ourselves. What do you say to, you know, people that talk about Hamas and use deflections like Hamas?
Well, there's a few things to keep in mind. One of them is when you're tabling, we know because we've read their manuals that there's a strategy to try to create disturbance and controversy around a table because that drives neutral people away. So keep in mind that it's important to engage people in conversation, but it's important not to make the conflict such that other people don't come up and get the information that you're trying to educate them with. So if at all possible, if there's going to be a heated debate or encounter, try to drift it away from the table so that it isn't blocking access to open-minded people who might want to see the information. In terms of those arguments, you got to pick your arguments, right? Sometimes they're just trying to deflect you and there's no point in engaging. But points to keep in mind are the Bote Gaza and more generally the Solidarity Movement isn't in support of Hamas or any government. We're not in supporting the Harper government. I don't support the Hamas government. It's a Canadian people-to-people civil society campaign. So it's not about supporting Hamas. About rockets and missiles and danger to civilians, yeah, those are wrong. the rockets and missiles that Israel fires at Gaza are far, far greater in number and do far, far more damage and kill far more people. The death count, even in a year when there isn't an attack and a massacre, is much higher of Palestinians in Gaza dying than any Israeli who's ever harmed by anything fired out of Gaza. So if protection is a right, then the people who are in need of protection are the civilians population of Gaza. In terms of the security of Israelis, I think it's important to remember that at the time of Cast Lead, an Israeli former Secret Service head, whose name was Ephraim Halevi, a man who devoted his life and his working career to defending Israeli security, not a Palestinian sympathizer by any stretch of the imagination. He said the best thing we could do to ensure the security of Israelis is to lift the blockade. The blockade is antithetical to the security of Israelis. So if we believe in a peaceful future for Palestinians and Israelis, we have to oppose the blockade. Because the blockade is just maintaining Hamas in power. It's maintaining more people who are going to become hopeless and go towards hopeless and desperate acts. If we remove the blockade and give people the freedom that every human being has a right to, there'll be less people inclined to get involved with hopeless acts. I mean, I think that's very clear. If you remove hope, people do hopeless things.
What do you have to say to people that try to justify suicide bombing? You don't know what they feel. I would do the same thing. Responses, any comments to that, responses?
It's true that we don't know. We're not in that position, and I wouldn't claim to know. I wouldn't presume to tell somebody, I know what you're feeling, because I don't. I don't know what they're suffering. I do know what has worked historically, and I'm not such a principled pacifist that I would say there's never a place for armed resistance. I think there's a place for armed resistance in contexts where the people can win. I think most of the struggles we're involved in are not places where armed resistance can win at this time. Most of the struggles that people I know who are involved in, nonviolent people power is much more powerful than anybody picking up any weapon. So it's not a categorical, we never do that, we always do this. For me, it's really a practical thing, is what has the greatest power to move things. And I think the power of nonviolent civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance, which is very strong in Palestine. I mean, it doesn't get reported in our media, but there have been lots and lots and lots of peaceful demonstrations, lots and lots of people who've been doing active civil disobedience. But of course, what gets picked up by the media are the few cases of violent responses. So I'm not going to get into a debate of what people should or shouldn't do. Everybody should do what they think is necessary for the struggle. I have my own views about what I think is effective. And I don't think you should pick a fighting match when you can't win.
A few days ago, I encountered a young man, an acquaintance, and he was interested in knowing my perspective of Palestine, and my response to him was, I have no perspective. These are facts. So you look at the facts. You don't look for my opinion. And he was adamant in wanting my opinion, and I kept presenting him with facts. And then a few minutes later, with a finger wag, he was like, well, I believe in the one-state solution. And I said, you're not allowed to have an opinion in regards to this matter. You can base a decision on facts. And when we finger wag and the finger wags I've seen enough of, and it's basically, it comes from a colonial background of people knowing best of what the other should or should not do, and them seeing as others, and him thinking that he's far more superior than me, in thinking that he has solutions that I couldn't think of, or the Palestinians couldn't think of. What do you say to someone like that?
I don't have a script. The guy who was here earlier has a script. I don't have a script for every encounter, but I mean that question is a recurring one: one state, two state. I mean, Jeff Halper has this line about one state, two state, red state, blue state. He says it sounds like we're not a Mother Goose. What do you call it? A Dr. Seuss rhyme, right? I don't have it's not that I don't have an opinion about it. I think we're not the people that are going to find that solution. The people who live in the region are going to find a solution. But what is clear to me is that there are certain elements that there have to be, whether you have a number of states somewhere between 0 and 3.5, right? Or whatever number you choose. But however many states there have to be, there has to be respect for international law. There has to be respect for fundamental human rights. There has to be a right of return for refugees. There has to be a restoration of stolen and expropriated property. Now, it's imaginable that that could happen in a 2-state, a 1.5, a 3.5, or 0-state solution. I can imagine lots of possibilities. How to get there is the tough part. You know, people are very down on Chomsky because of him talking about the pragmatics of a 2-state solution. But if you look at an extended interview with him, I can find this one for you. He actually says, we've been talking, the people of his political persuasion have been talking about a one-state solution since the 1930s, before there was a state of Israel, that there should be a binational state. And the 2-state solution is simply a pragmatic way to get there, right? And as he says, ultimately, he's not somebody who believes in states, so he'd rather there was no state, right? But how do you get there? You have to think about steps. So his view is not that the 2-state solution is like the final step. It's a step towards something that is possible because there's a certain international consensus, and maybe you could get beyond that. And ultimately, it would be awesome if you could go from Jordan to Lebanon to Syria to Egypt, right? And no borders sounds kind of radical now, but Jeff Halper's term is a United States of the Middle East, or a Union of the Middle East, where people would have national rights within certain domains, but they would also have human rights across borders. So I think we should, in terms of solutions, allow ourselves to imagine, like I say, somewhere between 0 and 3 states. There may be pragmatic steps about how to get there. But ultimately, for me, less interesting than which integer number we associate with the states is the respect for fundamental rights, regardless of how many states there are. And that is something we can begin demanding now, and shouldn't stop demanding until it comes.
How did you get these pictures?
Which
pictures
ones?
Of your like the pictures of prison.
So Ehab found them on the internet. There's pictures of Givon prison on the internet. I hope to be able to capture some images from the video that the British women did, just because there's pictures of like the cell doors and the bunk beds in prison, and our little patio with the grill work on the roof. So I mean, they were able to smuggle in a camera apparently, which was certainly not something we were able to do.
How did you feel going through Ben Gurion?
Well, it isn't a typical airport experience, right? I mean, you're frisked, you're searched a lot, and you're sort of held. I wasn't cuffed. And when we went to the airport, one of the Irish guys was cuffed. But you're in a immigration detention area the whole time, and there's a lot of waiting, a lot of searching, questioning, and then the detention cells are like sealed. They're horrible. They're worse than prison. They're quite nasty. And again, security guys. We had our consular visit, and then when the consul left, we had the security guy show up for another conversation. I don't work for security. I'm just here to have a conversation with you. Yeah, that's right. What's this conversation about? You're asking me questions that you already know the answer to, right? This is not a conversation. But yeah, it's no fun. But apparently traveling to Ben Gurion isn't fun for a lot of people, right? So a lot of people get searched quite humiliatingly. Even the journalists who were released. Well, 2 of them were held in prison with us, right? Jihan Hafiz and Hassan Ghani were held in prison with us. But the 2 Al Jazeera guys got out the same day. Like, they were given a 24-hour order to get out of the country. But they were searched a lot. The Al Jazeera guy from Spain, Zubiri, Ayman Zubiri, he was, as he says, deliberately humiliated. So they've already searched you, and then they take you to the airport, and they say, drop your pants again, right? Because we have to drop your pants, we have to do this, we have to humiliate you, not once, but 3 more times before you get on the plane. And we're going to have a guy following you around and looking inside your undergarments and things like this. So it's, like I said, it's sort of a national pastime, the ritual humiliation of searching, the ritual humiliation of interrogation, just to show that even the most petty guard officer has authority to put you through this.
And the plane ride back, did you encounter any Zionists? Who were you sitting beside? What did you eat?
You want to know about prison food, airport? We had a normal air. I mean, it was weird because we still didn't have our documents. Like, they'd taken our documents on the first day. I didn't get my passport back until we landed, and the flight crew actually are the enforcers on the deportation. So the flight crew keep your documents, hand them to Canadian immigration, and say these people are being deported. So Ehab and I sat together. We were at the back of the regular economy class. We didn't interact with anybody else. They brought us flight meals. They said we couldn't have newspapers, but at that point we were a few hours away from getting outside news. I forgot to mention that the first news that was breaking as we came out was when the fact that Obama and Sarkozy were talking in Europe about what a liar Netanyahu was. So it was like, oh yeah, our experience from the top down, the guy you got lied to. That's in my notes. I have to get my notes on my PowerPoint. So yeah, from my point of view, the detention continued until we got off the plane and actually met Canadian security. And I was very happy to get my passport back. I wasn't really attached to like the Canadian passport before this, but it was really nice to get it back. The meals weren't terrible. They were prison meals, but it wasn't anything special. It wasn't especially bad. We had trouble feeding Trevor because there's an enormous rugby player from Ireland, so we had to like collect extra food to feed Trevor. But
did they book your flight?
Yeah, we didn't pay for anything. That was their other threat. They said we had to sign their documents and we had to pay for our own flights out, and we said no, we weren't paying for our kidnappers to return us, and they ended up booking us through. Some of the women paid to get out. They had other issues. They didn't want to stay in prison. It was worse on the women's side. I mean, the lesson is you don't want to be 4, 5, 6 people. You want to be 10 or a dozen. So they were getting pushed around more. So they paid, but they were. Karen was just going to Turkey. Her husband was waiting for her in Turkey because he had been with us at departure. So Jihan unfortunately got deported all the way back to the U.S. and had to return to Egypt where her partner was. But you don't really have your choice of what you're doing. We were worried about the British journalist who was with us, Hassan Ghani, because he had been with the Mavi, so he was sort of a marked man, and the British consul really didn't want to have anything to do with him. So we were worried that he was going to be the one left behind, but he was deported at the same time as the Irish was, the 7th day.
Was there going to be a family reunion?
Well, we get together on Facebook. I've been on a standing invitation to go to Ireland and sing some of the freedom songs that we sang in prison. It's even hard to get together the Canadians from across the country. I mean, distances are big in this country. But I'm headed east. There weren't delegates on this boat, but there's people in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland who want to hear the Tahrir story. So I'll be heading there in February and talking it up. And Ehab's going to BC to talk it up. So we're taking our story on the road.
What was the mental preparation? How did you, you said that, 2010, I think July was it? July 2010,
yeah.
August 2010, get a boat started. How did you mentally prepare for something like this?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, the campaign is about raising money, about all the legalities and technicalities of getting a boat registered in the water and all that kind of stuff. You know that you need to do some preparation in terms of nonviolence training, but we were scrambling at the last minute to get trainers, and we got awesome people. But people with experience from different sorts of conflicts, people from previous flotillas. So we got good training. But unfortunately, in all of those tasks, and again, it's a volunteer organization, so there's no paid staff. Everybody's doing this on their non-spare time, right? The task about training and preparation gets pushed to the last minute. Fortunately, we had time on the boat to sort of center and think, okay, what are we going to do here? In this scenario, I'm going to buddy with you. We're going to make sure we know where you are. These are your triggers. These are your behaviors that you have to worry about. Because you want to know the people you're with in a very personal way, almost an intimate way, so that you know that you might get stuck in prison together. You might be holding arms. I was linking arms with Ehab when I got tasered, which turns out a good thing to do because you can share some of the shock across 2 wet T-shirts, right, or 2 wet sleeves. But we didn't. Obviously, that wasn't a plan. But you're very close to people. I was told last spring that I should learn to meditate, but I never found time to learn to meditate. So it's still on my to-do list. I've got some guided meditation recordings that I never got around to. But my personal meditation was singing. I sang to myself, songs from my childhood, songs that have a certain resonance for me, from my family, which I knew it would make me cry. I should have mentioned this. I didn't think of it when Muhammad talked about crying. I knew that songs that remind me of my family would make me cry, but it was a controlled way that I knew, okay, I'm going to break down. And then I'm going to gather myself together and I'm going to sing it through until as many times as it takes to get all the way through without breaking down. So for me, that was my personal meditation.